this is a report that we in WWF have done together with the GRID-Arendal. GRID-Arendal they've done the actual writing with then feedback from us. So it's Louise who's written the report, and Christian has been in charge of the actual projects from GRID-Arendal side, and I've been in charge from WWF side. We've also involved colleagues in the international network of WWF. And the overall objective of the report was to build a common understanding of what ecosystem-based IOM is, and to make the existing research and experience available to the global community. We wanted to explain IOM as a framework for ocean management and make clear how ecosystem-based IOM can help governments achieve sustainable ocean economies. Also, we wanted to see how ecosystem-based integrated ocean management can be implemented in order to succeed with national objectives. So then a set of general principles based on good practice and applicable across nations was identified and described. And we define, and I'm sure Louise will say more about this, but we define ecosystem-based IOM as an adaptive approach for governing human activities at sea, rooted in the ecosystem approach, guided by the SDGs with a strong focus on improving the ecological status of the ocean and on strategic integration across governance, knowledge, and stakeholder silos. So with that, I'm not going to talk anymore. I think I'll just give the word to Lise, and then, so if you have questions, I think we should just keep them for the end after her presentation. And then, yeah, I'll be back to try to manage the discussion. Louise.
Okay.
And everyone, please just mute your microphones when while she's.
Thank you, Inge. That was literally what I was just going to ask everybody to do. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So if I go into presentation mode. I'm not on the first page. Here we are. Here's my cover page. Okay, so what I would like to present to you today is an overview of this report on ecosystem-based integrated ocean management as a framework for sustainable ocean economy development. That has been a big part of my working life over the past few months. I'm Louise Liebeknecht. I'm a marine spatial planning expert. I've been at GRID-Arendal for just over a year now, so this has actually been a big part of my work for GRID so far. I've actually really enjoyed doing this because it's given me an opportunity to really delve into the literature on this topic, which I have a lot of previous experience in, but we don't always have the time to do this in-depth research to really refresh our knowledge of the current literature on these topics, which are very rapidly evolving actually. So yeah, so I really enjoyed this. I have a couple of slides in here that are just about GRID. I assume that you're all familiar with GRID-Arendal. I put these in here in case you'd like to share these slides with people who are not here today. I just wanted to highlight that ecosystems, economies, and sustainable development, this is a big theme of work at GRID, and that includes developing ways of capturing the fundamental role of healthy ecosystems for social and economic development, and that of course includes a lot of work that we do on sustainable blue economy, which, as Christian mentioned, is also one of his areas of expertise. Before I go into the content of this report, I would just like to talk a little bit about my process in writing it and what I was aiming for and some of the challenges that I encountered, and how I addressed them. So the main target audience I had in mind is people who work in the public sector for ministries, the administrative bodies, or the governance organizations who might not necessarily have a technical background in anything to do with environmental management or ocean management or economic development or anything, who might come from a wide variety of backgrounds and who end up having an aspect of ocean management land on their desk. So that might be anything to do with deciding who can do what, where, when at sea, or anything related to the institutional or the legal framework behind that, or gathering the knowledge base to help support those planning and decision-making processes. And what I wanted to do is to provide people like that who might not necessarily have a strong technical background or subject background, to give them an up-to-date orientation around existing literature on what is quite a big and quite a diverse topic, but to also provide a real tangible and practical and realistic sense of how the concepts that are in the literature can actually be operationalized. And that was really important to me. So I really wanted to scratch beneath the surface and provide people with a sense that they're sort of empowered to either go and find out more, that they know where to look to find out more, or with a sense of what they actually have to do in order to implement ecosystem-based and integrated ocean management. And I wanted to add value to the existing guidance and the academic and the great literature. There is quite a lot written about this topic already. There's a lot of really, really good materials, I think, that introduce the concept at a broad level, that are very easy to understand, that present frameworks in a very clear manner. So I didn't want to repeat that or provide an updated version of that. I actually wanted to, as I said, dig beneath that surface a little bit more. As soon as you start doing that, you face a number of challenges. And I've spoken about this in the report a little bit towards the end. I think the challenges or the complexities aren't related to the concepts or the technical tools about integrated ocean management or the ecosystem-based management approach themselves. It's not really about that. It's about the fact that the underlying challenge that we're trying to address here is a sustainability transformation. We're trying to transform whole economies. That's a wicked problem in the classic sense that, you know, this is a very complicated, interrelated type of policy problem that is inherently difficult to achieve, which is why we are where we are in a number of sustainability related challenges, not least global climate change. I think a lot of the complexity just arises from that. That sustainability transformations really are the biggest challenges that we're facing as humans in the Anthropocene, but they're also the most important challenges for us to meet. Now, the good news is that actually in the technical side, there are plenty of solutions. There are plenty of tools. There's, I think, especially in recent years in this field of ocean management, there's been a real shift towards multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research that is really pulling together knowledge excuse me, from a whole range of academic disciplines. So there's plenty of knowledge, there are plenty of solutions, there are plenty of approaches, frameworks and tools that can be implemented. The issue is, I think, is a different one. It's not a technical, the barriers that we're facing aren't technical. The main ones, I think the main barriers we're facing are these value differences that, you know, that can be profound between different people. And ocean management, ultimately, as you all know, this is a political arena. And even when people are using the same language, sometimes they mean different things in an operational sense. And that is actually visible in the academic literature itself. And that then makes it challenging when you're trying to review it and people are using the same language, but then you're reading into what they actually mean, and sometimes they actually mean slightly different things, or they have different overarching goals in mind as to where they want to get to. So I wanted to present a structured orientation through all of this and give people a sense of what is possible, and that there are actually a lot of approaches and solutions that can be used, but without pretending that these complexities don't exist, because I think anybody who starts work in this field will encounter these difficulties and complexities. So I'd rather address them. So the approach I took in writing this was to acknowledge these challenges and these value differences and the tensions that are visible in the literature. But in reviewing the solutions and approaches, really to focus on the common elements that they all contain. So ecosystem-based management, as we'll see a little bit later, is actually, it's actually a multifaceted concept. Integrated and ecosystem-based ocean management is also a multifaceted concept with multiple elements to it. So I really wanted to review the literature and focus and bring together the core aspects of and illustrate the diversity and the range of tools and solutions that are available, to give people a real sense of, okay, so this is at the very core, this is what it's about, and here's how you can operationalize this. The thread that runs through the report goes from theory to practice. So I'm starting at a conceptual level, and as I'm going through, it gets more and more practical, and ends with a brief discussion of some real life case studies. The questions that I've aimed to answer very basic questions, which is why do we need to change the approach to ocean management? Like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Where do we want to get to? What is this thing we call ecosystem-based integrated ocean management? And as Inga was talking just now, Inga, thank you so much for reading out that definition, because I realized that I haven't actually put that definition on any one of my slides, which is a huge failure, and I really should have done that. I have actually delved straight into breaking down each one of those elements, so I have defined it in much more detail, but I haven't actually put that overarching wording on the slide. It's actually on the front page, on the first page of the report itself. So the ecosystem-based integrated ocean management is an adaptive process. It's focused on ecosystem dynamics, ecosystem connections, and on human interrelationships with those ecosystems and the interdependencies of humans on ecosystems. Then I move on to the how. Like, how do you implement this approach? The what and the how are actually very difficult to keep apart very clearly, and you'll see as you read through this report that actually I begin with the what, but in the section that is entitled what, I'm actually already moving towards the how on some specific cross-cutting elements. But then there's a whole section that focuses on adaptive management and what the adaptive management cycle is. And then I present some examples from some real world case studies. I have to acknowledge WWF at this point, because it was hugely helpful for me to go through several rounds of review and comment, in that it wasn't just me facing this literature with the support of Christian, obviously. It was a whole range of brains and years of professional experience that really helped me consolidate this and put a clearer structure onto this whole report. So thank you very much. Okay, so why? I'm not going to dwell on this a lot in this presentation. The report presents a summary of some of the key environmental issues that we're facing in the ocean today. This figure is from a report by halvparten et al. 2015, so it's a few years old now, but it was the first real kind of comprehensive analysis that actually tried to map the global human footprint on ocean ecosystems, with the red colors indicating more impact, like a higher level of impact of human activities on ocean ecosystems. And I think this map just really illustrates that, even though we think of the oceans as remote and big and far away and pristine, we're actually having a huge direct footprint on oceans and ocean ecosystems already today. And that's without accounting for future developments in new industries that might develop. So the report, oh, sorry, my mouse isn't working. Let me do it this way. So the report briefly mentions a number of key impacts. big one obviously is fisheries. That's one of the biggest direct impacts that we have as humans on ocean ecosystems. So I'll talk a little bit about ecosystem level shifts that have actually happened that are down to fishing. You know, this idea of fishing down the food web. And then I talk about a whole range of activities that are already in place that range hugely in the type of activities, the type of impacts they cause, the scale, the spatial scales at which they operate. But they all combine together to create this cumulative impact that the previous map was illustrating. And this figure doesn't actually show some of the future developments that may happen, particularly deep sea mining, which is a big topic at the moment. So we're already at a stage where cumulative impacts are significant. This figure, this is not in the report. This is a figure that I've included on these slides to illustrate a point that is discussed in the report, which is the fact that the ocean ecosystem obviously is impacted by a whole range of activities that take place on land and in the air. It's, so we actually need to take a transboundary and a global perspective in applying the ecosystem approach, which is to recognize these connections and these downstream impacts. This figure is from a series of figures on ocean plastics. So this is just illustrating pathways of plastic pollution into the ocean. The other problem is, the other reason why we need to change the approach to ocean management is the fact that governance still tends to be quite siloed. So we sit in different ministries, in different administrative bodies, in different governance organizations that each have their specific management remit, and often different activities taking place in the ocean are managed in different silos. And that is true at the subnational level, at national level, and at the international level if we're looking at high seas governance. So these patterns are replicated around the world, and I think it's important to start to build some of these linkages across these silos so that you can actually start addressing conflicts between different activities, and you can look at transboundary impacts, and you can look at cumulative impacts on the ocean environment. So that's a why. The next question, which I think is actually a lot more important, which is the question of where to, like, where are we going with this? Well, in the title, it says we're going to a sustainable ocean economy. Well, okay, that's great. That sounds wonderful. What does that actually mean? So in the report, I've broken this down a little bit, looking at, well, what do we mean by ocean economy? There are actually different definitions of what that means. You know, are we referring purely to economic activities that take place in or on seawater or under seawater? Well, no, most definitions include upstream and downstream activities that actually are located on land. So that can be anybody who's supplying materials or services to enable activities to happen at sea, and then anybody who's processing or reselling products that come out of the ocean. And depending on how far you go upstream and downstream, the ocean, what you call the ocean economy, becomes bigger or smaller, and different authors, different studies draw that boundary in different places. The fact is there isn't a clear boundary. The ocean economy is actually embedded. It is completely integrated into wider local, regional, national, and global economies. And depending on where you draw those boundaries and what elements you count and what elements you don't count, you can actually come up with very different figures to try and represent the total monetary value of the ocean economy. Different authors have tried to do this. The figures are invariably very, very big. I've cited some in the report. It can be difficult to compare them though for the reasons that I just said. So what we do know is that the ocean economy is a significant part of the global economy. It's and especially at national and at subnational levels, the ocean economy becomes really, really important for a whole range of human well-being benefits. Which brings me on to the next question, which is really what the main focus of this section of the report is, which is, what should the ocean economy be for? There is a lot of talk about blue growth. That concept of blue growth is quite firmly anchored in a lot of policy, certainly in Europe and also in other parts of the world. And that's tied in with prevailing economic priorities that are centered on economic growth as an indicator of economic success and as a necessary engine to deliver a whole range of well-being benefits, jobs and livelihoods, etc. What I'm proposing here is that we shift this focus a little bit from blue growth, because what I see happening in the literature, and I think also sort of in the political arena, is this tension between this drive for growth and the drive to protect ecosystems. That invariably it's a trade-off. It seems, that's a narrative that seems to be coming out, that there's somehow a trade-off or a balance that has to be struck between those two. And that then means, it sort of implies you have either one or the other. It's sort of a bit that when it comes to individual specific decisions, what do you prioritize? I think there are ways to maybe circumvent that, what I see as a tension and as a key conflict, by taking a step back and taking a more holistic view of what we actually want to achieve. Because I think it's not what we actually care about as humans is actually not growth, it's other things. We use growth as a proxy. So this is reflected actually in the Sustainable Development Goals, which you're all familiar with. As in the arena of ocean management, people tend to focus a lot on SDG 14, obviously, life below water. That is the ocean SDG. However, there are actually a lot of interlinkages and interdependencies between all these SDGs, as more and more studies and authors are now writing about. That actually achieving SDG 14 has co-benefits for a whole range of other SDGs. So if you start actually looking through them, you go, no poverty. Well, okay, so ocean economy, jobs, that can help alleviate poverty. Zero hunger, well, ocean produces food, right? You start going through all these SDGs and you will see actually there isn't anything here for which the ocean isn't relevant and for which the ocean economy isn't relevant. So actually as people who are working in ocean management, as ocean management practitioners, we need to really have all these SDGs in mind, not just SDG 14, even though that is obviously at the core of the work that we have to do in safeguarding the ecosystem that all these other benefits depend upon. That's absolutely vital. But then if we're looking at all these SDGs, then it sort of becomes a bit overwhelming, like, how do we actually prioritize? How, like, do we trade off between them? Can we treat them as equal? Does achieving benefits for one SDG compensate for a loss or a lack of progress in another? And one visualization that I really like, this is also in the report, this is based on work done at Stockholm Resilience Center by Rockström and Suckdev, which actually rearranges the SDGs as a whole and says, well, actually, to reflect these interdependencies, we actually need to look at the three spheres of sustainability: the biological, the social, and the economic. And actually, the social sphere depends on a healthy ecological sphere as a basis, and a healthy economy depends on a healthy society. So that can actually help us to prioritize a little bit where we need to focus our attention. I've included the captions for some of these figures. I'm not going to read them out because you can all read this text yourself. It's also in the report. Again, I've done this mainly for the benefit of people who can't be here right now and who may wish to look at these slides at a later date. If you consolidate this image down into 2 dimensions, you can actually imagine something that looks quite similar to this. This is a figure that is from Kate Raworth's book on donut economics, published in 2017. I really, really like this visualization of a concept that is a good few years old. There's nothing particularly revolutionary about this in terms of sustainability management, this idea of a safe and just space for humanity that is bounded on 2 sides. That on the one hand, you need a social foundation, like there's certain levels of well-being, I think, that are important for all of us as human beings. That's, you know, ranges from issues to do with human rights to the basic things that we need for our survival and our mental and physical well-being, be that food, shelter, water, etc. And then we have an ecological ceiling. There are limits to what we can take out of ecosystems and how strongly we can impact ecosystems without destabilizing them. And yet we depend on healthy ecosystems because our economies and our societies are embedded within them. And in between the two, you have this safe and just space for our economies. So really our economies, the economic activities that we undertake should be occupying what in this figure is this green space. So you can use this actually as a way to start defining your strategic objectives and putting them together into a very holistic picture. You can also use this as a sort of a dashboard for assessing where we're at. This is also from the same book, this figure. This is a global assessment of how badly we're already overshooting some of the planetary boundaries in the ecological ceiling and how big the shortfall is globally on some of these social parameters. Now, I think this can be adapted for ocean economies. And this is what I mean by the blue donut. So this is a version of this figure. What I've done here is really just put all these planetary boundaries that are the same as in that previous figure, in that global figure along the top. So these are the planetary boundaries that as ocean managers we have to have in mind when we're planning, when we're taking strategic decisions in developing ocean economies. And then at the bottom here, we have to define local and regional ecosystem boundaries. These are case dependent, which is why there's these sort of empty boxes in here with the dashed lines, because this could be any number of local or regional parameters that we put on this boundaries that we need to actually identify as part of the adaptive management cycle. And then we can also map more regional or local priorities onto these globally important social parameters. I think there's a lot of scope in this visualization, both to aid us in strategic objective setting, in identifying priorities if we know where the biggest shortfalls and the biggest overshoots are in a particular location and in a particular context. And I think it's also a visualization that can help us in monitoring and in evaluating and in communicating how well we're doing or how badly we're doing. This is also consistent with sustainable blue economy definitions that already exist. So I've cited one from WWF here. So it's a marine-based economy that provides social and economic benefits for current and future generations. So it has all these social parameters in their food security, poverty, eradication, livelihoods, etc. It also restores, protects, and maintains the diversity, the productivity, etc. It's all about the ecosystem that we actually depend upon. You know, that's our natural capital. This is also compatible, by the way, with protecting ecosystem for their own sake. So it's, you know, we don't have to take a purely utilitarian perspective here. I think in terms of our spiritual and our mental well-being, knowing that we're protecting nature, something that's valuable in its own right, is also entirely compatible with this vision. And then the final point is actually an important one. This is about what is actually happening in this donut, the activities that are taking place, you know, that we're focusing on renewable energy, on circular material flows, on regenerative and on restorative activities that actually deliver these benefits. Notice how growth isn't actually mentioned here, because we tend to use growth as a proxy to help us get to all these places, all these benefits of things that really matter to us. And I think it's actually quite nice to reframe it and say, well, what are we actually trying to achieve? And then in some cases, growth in specific sectors, in specific industries, in specific activities is necessary. So then you do want to invest in growth, but only where the growth actually serves to achieve these strategic priorities. Okay, we're now moving on to the what. What do we mean by ecosystem-based integrated ocean management? And again, here I've sort of deconstructed it a little bit in the report, talking about what is ocean management. Ocean management is about managing activities in, on, and under the seawater. But what do we mean by integrated ocean management? I'm going to get on that in a minute. and what is ecosystem-based management. I'm actually going to start on that last point. What is ecosystem-based management? This is a concept that's been around for many years. It emerged in the 90s. It actually has its roots in conservation literature it goes back to the 1960s and 1970s. This idea that we take an integrated approach to management. It considers entire ecosystems, including humans. The goal is to maintain the ecosystem in a healthy, productive, and resilient condition, so that it can provide that foundation for our economies. It differs from current approaches these siloed approaches that usually focus on a single species, a single sector, a single activity or concern, and it considers cumulative impacts of different sectors. So this is a definition from 2005 that's building on the CBD Malawi principles. These are all in the report in detail. In this report, ecosystem-based management is the umbrella. It's the umbrella concept under which we then look at more specific components of it, right? Because it's actually a multifaceted concept. Ecosystem-based management in itself, if you delve into the literature, there is agreement on core elements, core principles that form part of EBM. But these have been changing. The emphasis has been changing in the literature over the years. There are actually 15 key principles that were identified in a relatively recent paper in 2015. The ones that come up the most consistently are the consideration of ecosystem connections, the management at appropriate spatial and temporal scales to reflect ecosystem dynamics, adaptive management, and then a whole range of principles related to different forms of integrations that I will talk about next. And within this literature, you can actually identify three clusters of interpretations of what EBM is. They're mutually compatible, they're interrelated, they complement each other. So there's no kind of tension or conflict here. I think just different people put emphasis on different elements. The one is focusing primarily on ecosystem conservation. Another is focusing on addressing human needs within ecosystem boundaries, which is more the focus of this report, because this report is about developing a sustainable ocean economy. So that's why this report has a fairly anthropocentric focus. And then there's a third cluster that's centered on the analysis and valuation of ecosystem services, which I'll speak about a bit later. So we take this umbrella one step further and say, well, so we're not talking about ecosystem-based management in general, we're actually talking about ecosystem-based integrated ocean management. And in the ocean management arena, there are key building blocks of this concept that all have common elements, that all share common ideas. One being centered on nature conservation, which is about marine protected area, and in particular marine protected area networks. That really should be an integral part of ocean management to ensure environmental sustainability, to give a space for nature to recover and thrive. These are best plans using systematic conservation planning principles. What do I mean? Well, these have been around in the literature for over 20 years. They're fairly well established. There are good tools now to help operationalize these. The idea is that you protect the full range of biodiversity in networks of protected areas at large spatial scales, that are connected, that are cost efficient, that are adequate in protecting enough of everything, and that actually represent the full range of biodiversity. Okay, so the question that emerges here, well, what about areas that are special or unique? You'll see this doesn't actually appear in these principles. Well, there's a separate set of principles around identifying EPSAs, or ecologically and biologically significant marine areas, which also are detailed in the report. These can be very, very important to protect. So these are areas that are special, that are unique, that are particularly diverse, that are particularly productive, that play a particularly important role in the life stages of certain species. So these areas are also really, really important to consider in MPA network planning. Then we have marine spatial planning, which centers on the where of ocean management. So where do we allow who to do what at sea? And then there's a concept which is very closely related, which is the integrated coastal zone management concept, which is the equivalent really to integrated ocean management, but with a more coastal focus. It's actually more focused on managing terrestrial activities, land-based activities that take place in the coastal zone, including in coastal watersheds. And under the umbrella of ecosystem-based management, this is obviously also important to manage these downstream impacts on the marine environment. So let's look at integration. Different people mean different things when they talk about integration. So in terms of integrating strategic goals, I've already covered that through this idea of the ocean donut. So I'm not talking about integration of strategic goals at that level. What I'm talking about here is operational integration. So we're moving towards the how, like how do we implement ecosystem-based integrated ocean management. Now, I've already mentioned the need to manage across land-sea boundaries and the need to integrate across these governance silos. But there's actually a lot more to integration. Again, I'm not going to read out this caption here in detail. I'm going to say everything that's in this caption. There are 5 forms of integration, I think, that you can identify when you actually read the literature. People don't always articulate very well what they mean by integration. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're actually discussing past each other because they're talking about different types of integration without realizing it. So I think this classification of 5 types of integration can actually help us be clearer in the way that we communicate with each other and in the way that we actually plan for different types of integration when we're planning specific processes in ocean management. So I'll start with governance integration at the top here. So that is about building those connections between those governance silos. So at the national level, that can be between different ministries. And at the subnational level, there's equivalent governance bodies that can exist at local or provincial or state level. So that's horizontal integration. Then, of course, we also need to vertically integrate across the different scales of governance. That extends into the international level as well. So there's different ways in which this can work, you know, whether you establish interministerial working groups, whether you establish new cross-sectoral bodies, whether you establish more informal communication mechanisms. This can work in many, many different ways. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to this. Then there is transboundary integration. I've represented this twice in this figure here. So we have transboundary integration across international boundaries. So that's building connections with governing bodies, with knowledge providers and stakeholders in other countries. That's because ocean ecosystems don't care about national boundaries. And then we have transboundary integration across a land-sea boundary. So that is really about building connections with governance bodies and decision-making processes and planning processes in the terrestrial sphere to manage the downstream impacts on the ocean environment. All of these forms of integrations flow into ecosystem-based ocean management. So they're all important. You can't always achieve everything perfectly, I will say this up front, but I think at least this helps you sort of plan and prioritize a bit better maybe. Now, if you move to the bottom part of this picture, there's 2 more forms of integration, well, 3 more forms of integration actually. I'll start with knowledge integration here. So this is on the one hand about bringing different academic fields together, bringing knowledge from environmental sciences, from geography, social sciences, economics, system science, you know, new technological developments. There's research in artificial intelligence even, which can help us, you know, better understand complex systems. So there's a whole range of fields that are relevant here. And I think there's been a real move in recent years towards more multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research, which is great because we need that. Then you have the transdisciplinary arrow. Now this is interesting because this is actually this flows across into the stakeholder integration box, because in transdisciplinary knowledge integration, we're bringing knowledge in that's not within academic silos, but that resides within stakeholders' brains and within local communities. That can be traditional knowledge, that can be local knowledge about human activities, about impacts on the ecosystems, and also about what people value, what's important to people. Then you'll see this little circle in here. which is talking about integration of system dynamics. I've sort of put this as something that sits within knowledge integration, which sort of illustrates really where we want to get to. In order to be able to do well at ecosystem-based integrated ocean management, we need to understand as best we can the complex systems that we're trying to manage, or that we're trying to operate within, which are socio-ecological systems, and which are dynamic. I think this area is very much in its infancy. I'm seeing academic research coming out which can maybe help us a few years down the line. I don't think we're there yet in the operationalization of this. But I've put it in here because I think it matters, and I think it's an area that we should keep our eyes on. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about stakeholder integration, because this is one that is always mentioned in every paper about ecosystem-based management, about marine spatial planning, about integrated coastal zone management. Stakeholder participation, stakeholder integration is always mentioned as key, but people aren't often clear about what that actually means, because there's many different ways in which stakeholders can be integrated in a process, and there is no single approach or single recipe for you to follow. So it's important, but why, when, how, who? Okay, so the report goes into some detail on these questions. They're very basic questions. I think I always like to come back and say, okay, let's ask the really simple, the very dumb sounding questions that are actually really, really important to clarify and to develop a shared understanding of why do we need stakeholders to participate in a particular process. How is it best carried out? When should it be carried out? What role should stakeholders be given? And who are the stakeholders that need to be involved? What are the risks and incentives for stakeholders to participate? And what are the risks and costs of participation for the process and its outcomes? I can't cover all of this in this presentation. It's all in the report. But one thing I wanted to highlight is this idea of a ladder of participation, which you've probably already seen, which is the idea that excuse me, you can devolve different levels of power to stakeholders from authorities. This figure here is adapted. It was actually created based on a paper by Morf et al, which is based on an empirical review of European marine spatial planning case studies. So this reflects practices that are actually being implemented. It doesn't reflect all possible forms of stakeholder engagement. But I think it's a very, very useful orientation, and it has an empirical founding, which I really liked about this publication, which is why I chose this particular version of the ladder. So if we zoom into this, at the lowest level of power devolution, you have this idea of information provision, where all you're doing is you're giving information as an authority to stakeholders about what they can and can't do. Now, there is a place for this in ecosystem-based integrated ocean management. Even though we keep talking about empowering stakeholders as somehow that being important, there are situations in which actually the opposite is true. In emergency situations, when it's about safety, about protecting lives at sea, when it's about putting emergency measures in place, if you can see that somebody is causing significant damage on protected ecosystems, for example, you might have to put measures in place at very short notice. And that's perfectly legitimate, and it's important. And in that case, all you're doing is you're providing information. You're not actually involving stakeholders at all in the decision-making process. The next step up is very, very common in Europe, which is anchored in European legislation, which is the requirement for strategic planning processes to at least consult stakeholders and allow them to voice their opinion, usually on a bilateral basis, which means that every stakeholder or every interested party individually can comment on a plan or an idea for a new development. Authorities are obliged to listen, but they retain full power. So they have no obligation to act on what people are saying. Then at the next two rungs up, you have deliberation and collaboration. You'll see these black arrows here around the stakeholder icon, because here you're actually bringing stakeholders from different sectors together, and they need to talk to each other. They need to actually work together jointly, right? To learn from each other, to either develop recommendations or to actually help plan. So depending on how much power you devolve to them, to help, you can actually empower them to help define processes and outcomes. These are two interesting rungs, I think, because of this joint collaborative cross-sectoral element, which can have a whole range of benefits. but it is also costly. You need to support this properly, and if you don't have the resources to do so, then it can backfire. I would also say that the more power you devolve to stakeholders, that only works if that power devolution is genuine. So if you're telling people that they have power and there's a cost to them to participate, often it takes time, it takes effort, it can have social impacts on people who are participating as well. You have a responsibility to make sure that what you're telling them is true, that they actually do genuinely have power and influence. And if you can't do that, then it's actually better sometimes to go for a straightforward consultation process. So like I said, there is no one perfect way of doing things. It really depends on circumstance. And then the two highest level here is really about devolving either the right to veto outcomes or to actually lead a process to stakeholders or to individual key stakeholders. Now, within the pool of case studies that the authors analysed for this particular ladder, there weren't any cross-sectoral collaborative elements at these highest level, but there are, of course, processes in other parts of the world where that does happen, where you have community level co-management of local marine protected areas, for example, of local fisheries. So where you do have this cross-sectoral collaborative engagement going on at the highest level of power devolution. That just says everything that I just told you. I'm now going to move on to how, and the animations aren't working. So, like I said, it's difficult to separate the what and the how. So I have actually already talked a lot about how to operationalize stakeholder engagement, for example. I'm now taking a step back and saying, okay, let's take this image of integrated and ecosystem-based ocean management as a whole. How do we actually go about operationalizing this idea and all these cross-cutting elements that I've just talked about? Well, key to this, and this in every publication, every set of guidelines about EBM and about integrated ocean management, this adaptive management cycle appears, or a version of it appears. This illustration is based on a publication by UNEP WCMC, which from last year, which I really like because it's, even though it's very, very high level, it's very generic, it's nice and balanced, and it's clear, and it gives you a really good big picture overview of what is meant by adaptive management. So at the core, you have these different steps of starting by assessing, understanding the system that you're operating within, understanding the current ecosystem, the current impacts on it, the current activities that are going on. And on that basis, you then say, okay, well, you need to define where we want to go, which is actually up here. So once you understand where you're at right now and where you want to go, you can then start developing plans, usually in a scenario development processes, and there's well-established processes to help do that: strategic environmental assessment, state of marine environment reporting. There's different approaches, and they're all mentioned in the report. And then you move on to implementation. This is a really crucial step, actually, going from the management and the management plan development, the planning, which is often done very, very well, to actually translating that and enforcing that in reality. This is the step that often fails to happen. But of course, if you don't do that, then you're not achieving any of the objectives that you've set yourself. And then you need to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness, and then identify shortfalls, and then you go around further iterations of this planning cycle. Like I already mentioned, there are pre-planning stages and cross-cutting elements that actually matter at every stage of this cycle. So the 5 forms of integration that I just mentioned, that I just talked about in some detail, they need to be defined for every single step of this cycle. You need goals and objectives. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because there's more to this than is often illustrated in existing guidance. And then I also want to briefly mention these contextual elements that are represented here. So these are the enabling conditions that you depend upon for this cycle to work. So you need the legal and governance underpinning, the legal and governance frameworks to help you do this. And that's about setting up the right piece of legislation that will empower you to enforce things, for example, that will create the institutions and provide the means through which resources and capacities are then channeled to actually make this happen. There's a lot to capacity. I haven't got time to go into it now. I've delved into it a little bit into the detail, but capacity building is a really important aspect to help make this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about setting goals and objectives now. How are we doing for time? Oh gosh. Inga, do you want me to?
Yeah, just I've written to everyone that yes, we are over time, but I think we should just continue the presentation so that since I'm recording it, so we can share it with everyone, and anyone who has the time to stay on are very welcome to stay, and then we can even do questions after if people have time. But yeah, apologies for going over time, and I suggest you just continue.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So, the gold standard for objective setting that appears time and time again in guidance documents is this idea of SMART objective, of making sure that you develop objectives that are specific, that are measurable, that are achievable, relevant to the overarching goals of your process, the goals that you've identified in your blue donut, and that have a time limitation to them, which then enables you to use these objectives as a benchmark in monitoring and evaluation. So it's very difficult to carry out effective monitoring and evaluation if you don't have SMART objectives. So SMART objectives are important. I think they do really matter to help operationalize EBIOM. They're not the only type of objectives that you need, however. There is more to this. And I think this is a point that is sometimes lost or glossed over, or people aren't made aware of. And what this has led to in some case studies that I'm fairly familiar with is that people have tried to start identifying SMART objectives for ecosystem-based management. So for every component of an ecosystem, which is actually kind of the opposite of integrated management, because you're attempting to break down the ecosystem into a whole range of very specific components, and you're trying to manage and measure and evaluate each one individually. It becomes an impossible administrative burden. It's a huge resource investment, and I don't think it's necessarily always a good idea. It's better to focus on some key indicators that you need to define and set some SMART objectives for those. And that can relate to not just to the ecosystem, but also to the effectiveness of management measures. For example, you can set SMART objectives for that. One approach, this is actually from business management, but I think this works really well to help us come up with a more functional framework of different levels of goals and objective setting. This is this idea of results-based management. So this is from the report, so I've explained all this in a bit more detail in the report, but the idea is that you break down the goals and objectives that you try and achieve in a process into different steps along a results chain. So you start by looking at what you're putting into a process, and you can set goals and objectives for this, right? These are things that are under your control, right? So how much resources you put into a process, and then the activities that you take part as that, whether that's planning workshops, technical work, communication, information, or activities related to the next step on the planning cycle, which is about implementation and monitoring and evaluation. These are all fully controllable. They're describable, they're also quantifiable. So you can set some really good SMART objectives for these steps. When it comes to outputs, direct outputs that are still under your direct control, for example, reports, maps, data analysis results, again, you can set SMART objectives because you can fully control these things and you can quantify them. Then you're moving on to the more intermediate and long-term outcomes. Now we're moving towards the overarching goals. We're actually moving towards the goals that really matter. These are actually the most important ones to achieve. But the more important they become, the broader they become, and the harder they become to measure. An example of intermediate outcomes could be, for example, a given number of people with improved skills or knowledge following a training event. So if you've invested in capacity building, remember that capacity building element being an important pre-exit, like enabling condition for this adaptive management cycle. It can be an area of sea where damaging activities no longer occur. Less tangible than these direct outputs, but you do have a fairly high level of control over this. You can often quantify and measure them. So, maybe you can have 1 or 2 SMART objectives for some intermediate outcomes that you can then go and monitor and evaluate. then you have this is immediate outcomes, and you have the intermediate outcomes, which is one step further towards long term, which is, from a capacity building event, it might be trust and social capital. It could be cultural and institutional changes needed to make integration mechanisms sustainable, behavioral changes in stakeholders. These are often hard to quantify and measure. So here is where you're moving towards maybe being able to use more qualitative evaluation methods rather than having some clear benchmarks that you're evaluating again. So you develop narratives, you carry out interviews, you try and evaluate at a broader sense if you're moving in the right direction or not. You know, and in the next round, next iteration of your planning cycle, you maybe want to reevaluate where you place your strategic priorities on the basis of this kind of monitoring and evaluation. So at this level, the SMART objectives become less and less useful. It's important to have these intermediate outcomes though, and to at least try and evaluate how well you're doing at achieving them. And then you have your ultimate outcomes, which is about the blue down, which is those really overarching strategic measures. And there often the monitoring and evaluation actually needs to be wrapped up into much more global processes, because ocean management isn't the only element that is actually helping to eradicate poverty, for example, or to, you know, increase equality between men and women, or whatever it is. Your contribution might be relatively minor as an ocean management. So there's national processes that are already in place, often tied to reporting against SDGs. Tools. So we're moving towards the final sections of the report now, where I give an overview of some of the tools that can help you as you're operationalizing EBIOM at different steps. Now, I started with this ambition of saying, right, I'm going to provide a global overview of all the different types of tools that you can use in integrated ocean management and ecosystem-based management. Actually, that's not possible, because when you look at the different activities that you need to undertake at different stages of the planning cycle, then there are so many different things that could count as tools. Tools to gather and analyze scientific data. Tools to incentivize behaviors that comply with management measures. This might be a piece of legislation here, right? Whereas gathering and analyzing scientific data, well, I don't know, that could be a sensor on a satellite. If we're talking down here, tools to help capture, understand, and integrate multiple values and different ways of understanding the world, then we're actually into methodologies that you use in multi and transdisciplinary research, for example. Obviously, most of these tools have applications that go way beyond EBIOM. They're whole fields of research and expertise in their own right. This is a bullet point list that I have literally copied and pasted from the report itself. So I mention all of these things to provide context and to explain why I'm not even trying to provide a comprehensive list of tools. The other reason why I'm not trying to provide a comprehensive list of tools is because this is, when it comes to technical tools, they evolve all the time. Literally, while I was finishing this report, actually, a new version of Marxan came out, which I haven't mentioned in this report because it's brand new, which is focused on connectivity. So what I'm doing instead is advising people to engage with relevant online user communities, mailing lists. There are so many experts out there. There's so much expertise that you will find. If you have a technical problem, you will find a technical solution to it. You just need to put a bit of time and effort into researching what is needed specifically for your circumstance. So what I've done instead is I've provided some examples, and I've grouped those. Excuse me. This is when you know that you really have been talking for too long. Okay, so the 4 categories of tools that I'm talking about, that I'm providing some examples of, they're very different categories. And this was done in order to illustrate the diversity of tools and the range of expertise that actually exists that you can draw from. So this is to balance the discussion of some of the challenges that you face and the fact that you're trying to resolve wicked problems in integrated ocean management. So I'm trying to guide people towards solutions here. and say, you know what, even though this is difficult, it is doable. We know how to do this. We have the knowledge, we have the expertise, we have the tools. So I'll talk briefly about decision support tools. I'm talking about tools for analysing and modelling conflicts and interactions, tools for governance analysis, and for ecosystem services valuation. So I talked briefly about Marksan as one example of a decision support tool, which can help you cut through multiple layers of information where you have multiple ecological, social and economic objectives that you want to achieve in a spatial planning situation. And it can help cut through this complexity of a multitude of input layers, all these different objectives, and develop different, or help you develop different spatial scenarios that meet multiple objectives at the same time. I'm a big fan of this tool in data-rich situations. Interestingly, actually, about this, and this is the same for all technical decision-making tools, there's literature that really demonstrates how well established some of these tools. They're well tested, well established in the literature, and they're used a lot in academia and in desk studies. They're not translating into use in management practice, in applied management practice. I think there is a real funding gap here to help actually make these tools more accessible through relevant training, through creating guidance and like online tutorials, training videos, etc. I have tried to do this in the past. I've tried to get some funding to actually help do that for Marksan specifically, and it's difficult because funders don't see the innovation value in it, but it then means that we have these amazing tools that you need to be an academic who has the time to sit down and really understand how they work in order to be able to gain the skills to use them, and often then that doesn't translate into management practice, which I think is a real shame. Then we have tools to analyze conflicts and interactions between different institutions, between different stakeholders that form these social networks that we need to understand in order to manage stakeholder participation well, for example, and in order to understand dynamic changes in the system. I quite like this framework that was developed by Klinger et al. This was actually a paper that was focused entirely on blue growth. But I think this framework that they propose can actually work in an ecosystem-based management context as well, where you differentiate between interactions that are competitive, that are antagonistic, that are negative in one direction but neutral in the other, that are amensal. So these are ecological terms for those of you who have a background in ecology. So amensal is just neutral. So these are activities that can coexist in the same place that just don't really impact on each other. And then you have activities that are beneficial to each other, either one being beneficial to the other or completely mutualistic. So if we talk about synergies between different activities, we might be talking about, say, a common physical platform that's used for renewable energy installation and for aquaculture, for example, which is what this paper was about. Or you can talk about port installations that serve multiple activities at the same time, so they have actually beneficial impacts on multiple other activities. Then we have tools that can help you understand the governance context that you operate within, and to help you improve the governance context that you operate within. This is a governance analysis framework from Bennett and Satterfield, which I really liked because I think it's very clear. It breaks down different elements of governance into institutions, structures and processes, and then really the objectives and attributes. So this is all about what makes good governance. And you can see how some of these things, they map back onto some of the social parameters in the blue donut, for example. So this is about helping you to make your process as good and as effective as it can be. And then we have a whole range of tools that are related to putting a monetary value on ecosystem services, which are commonly broken down into provisioning services. So they're direct products obtained from ecosystems, food, water, genetic resources. Cultural services, so those are intangible benefits. They can be aesthetic values, recreational values, spiritual and religious values. Then we have regulating services, which is about regulating the environment, for example, climate regulation, water purification, waste management, etc. And then we have the supporting services. So this is about the basic planetary life support. That's primary production, photosynthesis, nutrient cycling, and water cycling. These are the different types of services that ecosystems provide. If we put a completely utilitarian lens on nature and say, what is nature doing for us as humans? What is doing all these different things? How do we put a value on this? There's a whole range of methods to do that, to try and put a monetary value in it. This is useful in very specific circumstances when decisions are made on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, for example, and there is a decision maker somewhere that will inevitably look at the bottom line. And unless you put a monetary value on nature, it becomes very difficult for nature to be integrated, for it to count in decision making. There is quite a strong sort of current of people who actually don't like this approach, because they're saying it's actually facilitating this very utilitarian approach to nature, and say, well, on the one hand, and on the other hand, then there's criticism because of the methodological differences. How do you put a value on a spiritual or religious benefit, for example? And depending on what methodology you use, you can come up with values that are orders of magnitude different. So it's not always straightforward. So I think this is a very, very useful approach. I think it's very, very important. It's a very interesting field of research as well. But I think it's got to be used in the right circumstances and with the necessary circumspection. This is a quote I really like: working towards the vision of the blue donuts, my part. The quote is this bit, like, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. You might have seen this already. This is a quote that's often attributed to Albert Einstein. I did some digging. There is absolutely no evidence that Albert Einstein actually said this. So I'm not quite sure where this quote actually came from. I've put a link in a footnote in the report so you can explore different theories as to where this quote comes from, if you want to. But I think it is important. So when we're actually talking about the blue donut, we're talking about the things that our life depends on and the things that matter to us as humans. We can't put a monetary value on everything. The report ends with a very, very brief discussion of 5 case studies. Case studies that have implemented some aspects of ecosystem-based integrated ocean management with success. Nobody on Earth does everything perfectly. You know, multiple iterations of adaptive management, fully integrated in all 5 types of ecosystem-based management, and strategic objectives that are in line with this idea of ecological ceilings and social foundations. Because if everybody was doing this, then, well, we wouldn't be where we're at. However, there's a growing number of case studies now where at least some elements are being translated into operational practice. And one recommendation that I would like to make at the end of this is to actually focus more on analysing these case studies in a systematic way, to actually start trying to consolidate what works in practice and what doesn't work in practice, or what works under what circumstances in practice. I think we're in a position where we can start doing that. Obviously, this report wasn't the right place to do this. This is just providing some illustrative examples to give an idea of what has worked in some case studies. And these case studies aren't perfect by any means. So what I've done in the report is pulled out the elements of EBIOM that have worked well in each case study. So the Belize example, for example, that's a process that successfully applied the ecosystem services evaluation approach through a decision support tool, and used that as a way to connect ecosystems users and use CIS in a strategic analysis that evaluated trade-offs between alternative scenarios. Right? It was also a good example of a very effective consultation process. That's sort of more bilateral type consultation process, which demonstrates that you do not need to go to the highest level on this ladder of participation to do stakeholder engagement well. It's also a good example of scientific knowledge integration into decision making, partly through this INVEST tool. Then we have the Barents Sea Integrated Ocean Management Plan, which you'll be very familiar with. This is a successful example of governance integration in the establishment of a new interministerial body. which is one way to achieve horizontal governance integration. It's not the only way, but it's one way. I'd actually like to highlight the last point. I think it's a successful transition from planning into implementation, because there was a clear process that was actually planned for during that first part of the planning cycle, where, you know, there were some permanent working groups established to actually cover monitoring and the ongoing implementation of this adaptive management cycle. Then we have the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park rezoning plan. This is at the beginning of the 2000s that this rezoning exercise happened, and it's often held up as a fantastic example of integrated strategic marine spatial planning. And it was, in many ways, a hugely successful process. It's one of the few examples that I know of that is actually a second iteration around an adaptive management cycle. It's quite top down, because there's a single authority that's responsible for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and they have that power to actually take decisions as to who can do what where in this park. But they did include very comprehensive bilateral stakeholder consultation, and they integrated that with the use of a decision support tool, which was an early version of Marxam, which is, again, it's a rare example of that decision support tool actually having been used effectively in real world conservation planning in this case, as the rezoning centered on primarily on expanding highly protected marine protected areas within the marine park. It's a successful example of scientific knowledge integration to safeguard the ecological ceiling. It's a successful transition from planning to implementation. There's comprehensive monitoring in place. It is amazing, but it's also a cautionary tale. We are just reading headlines right now about a third major bleaching event. So it is a cautionary tale about the limitations of what you can achieve as an ocean manager by managing activities that are happening directly in the ocean. And it's a perfect illustration of why we need to embed ocean management in effective global measures to combat global challenges, in this case climate change. Because otherwise the best zoning plan is not going to save the Great Barrier Reef, unfortunately. Then there was an example of the Gulf of Maine Council. This is a joint mechanism between Canada and the USA to look at transboundary integration within the Gulf of Maine. This was included because it is transboundary integration that's happening effectively in two ways, so across land-sea boundaries and across national jurisdiction. This is an example that's not translating into effective management action, however. And I discussed that a little bit in the discussion of the case study. So again, there's a lot that's happening well, but it's not actually translating to any real impacts on the ground. And then we have an example in Southern Africa, which is one of the large marine ecosystem projects, of which there are many all around the world under the auspices of the United Nations. This example was chosen because I think this is a good example of an effective transboundary integration mechanism that draws its boundary based on ecosystem boundaries that span across EEZs of multiple nations. There's a permanent body in place, the Benguela Current Commission, that is a tri-party body that includes the representatives from the three countries that sit alongside this large marine ecosystem. They have collaborated to jointly identify EBSAs, that's the ecologically and biologically significant marine areas within this large marine ecosystem, and to systematically plan an MPA network, which is the South African part of it is already being implemented in national legislation. I think it's also a very nice example of effective international development cooperation through a project that is wrapping up right now. It's called Merisma, that was funded by the IAZ, with money from Germany, with a focus on participative capacity building. So remember how I said that capacity is a very, very important enabling condition, and this is a very nice example of building capacities locally and regionally. So that capacity then resides in the region for the long term, so it's a sustainable form of capacity building. Conclusion. I wish I really had a really, really punchy, wonderful conclusion for this, but because this is such a multi-faceted concept, there's so many different aspects to this, it's difficult to really come up with a really kind of punchy set of conclusions. I think the conclusions that I've tried to reflect on, just the very final page of the report is, well, yeah, the challenge that we're facing is big, but it's a challenge that really, really matters. It's this sustainability transformation that we need to achieve for the ocean economy, just like we need to achieve it for every other aspect of life. And when we put our mind to it, we can do it. What's happening right now, we're all sitting at home right now because of this coronavirus crisis. And I actually find it staggering and in a way very positive what's happening right now, because the reason why we're staying at home is to protect the weakest and the most vulnerable in our societies. It demonstrates that actually we are capable of putting what really matters above purely economic objectives. There are so many worries about what the economic impacts of this crisis are going to be, and yet here we are. We're saying there are some things that are more important. So I think this demonstrates that actually we are capable of taking some pretty radical transformative action when it really matters. So let's draw some strength from that. I haven't said anything about that in the report, obviously, because all this happened after I finished writing it, but the point is that the challenge we're facing in building a sustainable blue economy is a big challenge. It's one that's really important. It matters. And there are a lot of tools and solutions to draw from. We know how to do it. We know what to do. We know, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, we have the solutions, we have the framework. And we also have a growing empirical evidence base from real world applications that we can draw from, that we can learn from. So really all we need to do is do it.